Here is Sailor Kobe number 50 Legend Blue, a blue ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
As a blue ink goes, this is just blue, a standard blue with no standout qualities really about it, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is from the more extreme cases with nibs that you get some tone variation, though expected amounts, and there can be some shading given the right pen and paper to accompany it. A bad thing when an ink is picky like that. Now, on non-fountain pen-friendly paper, it performed fine, but the cheapest stuff, it really was unpleasant to use. Seeing this is just a standard blue, myself, I see no need to experience a bottle of it. Sampled and done.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry. A Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet. A Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Ahab.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get. Though we see it is very easy to read on the page, there's no problem at all. It doesn't get too light, which is always a worry with that pen. Now, we get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some shading throughout the writing, and it shows up fairly regularly with this nib. I think it did a really good job. Take a look at very quick on the second line, where it starts as a nice mid-tone in very, it gets darker at the R into and through that Y. Now quick starts dark on the Q, lightens up through the middle of the word, and gets very dark again at the K. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading or tone variation. It is a dark, bold blue on the page without anything else going on. Really solid performance. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, darker than it was with the soft fine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. Nice blue, really standard looking blue here. It does have some shading, I think a little bit better than it did with the soft fine. You see it in orders on the second line where it starts lighter on the OR. It's lighter as its midtone. The DE get quite a bit darker. It lightens into the R, darker at the S again. Who knew? Take a look at new on the first line, where it starts very dark at the K and E, but it's at the W that it becomes light again. So it shades fairly well. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as it was from the medium. There is no feathering and there is no spread. I'd be shocked if there was on this paper. It does shade as well as it did with the medium, but I think the wider lines help it show up a little bit more, but it's not more and bold, just as a fact. If we look at fact already on the second line, the F is a nice mid-tone into the A, the C lightens up, but the T is much darker than the rest of the word. Now already the A is lighter, the L is very dark, the R lightens up in tone, very dark into the E, lightening slightly at the A, little darker again at the D, much darker again at the Y. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, and we can easily write back here.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Really excellent combination with this paper and this ink from that pen. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone at the beginning as it was on the Clairfontaine. Now through the writing, maybe the feed wasn't keeping up, but it lightened up a little bit. Or maybe as the ink that was in the feed worked its way through. I couldn't tell, but there's not a lot of time between the previous and this writing sample. So if we were to look at where it changes to a lighter tone, on the third line, you see that the tone there we get is a bit more like we had with the medium on the Clairfontaine. Though it has no shading coming up, it's just changed the tone that it's writing in. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the bottom of the writing from the wet fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we still have shading very well. Take a look at several others on the first line. The SE is a bit darker than the VER, but it's at the end of the R up top that it darkens up a little bit, lightens into the A, darker again at the L, but others starts lighter, gets darker at the TH, lightens a little bit for the ERS at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering, it has no spread, it has shading, but not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. But this is not fountain pen friendly paper. It just seems to perform fairly well with it. We can see some of the shading that shows up like things on the second line, where it's the top of the H was a bit darker, and then the cross of that T really did make it darker. Most of the word is a nice midtone. It's during the downstroke of the G into the S that it darkens up quite a bit. And Palace, underneath that, the P is a midtone. It lightens up into the A, back to the midtone on the lace, but the E at the end is a bit darker than the rest of the word. Looking at the back of the page, there's no bleeding, there's no ghosting, there's no problem.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine, meaning this is a pretty opaque ink, not being affected by the tone of the paper that's underneath it. There is no feathering and there is no spread. There is some shading going on throughout what's going on. Take a look at through, that'll be on the fourth line. The T is lighter than the H, which is quite a bit darker. The R is lightening up a little bit, but the H at the end, much darker again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, which makes me feel that what happened in the last paper was kind of an effect of that paper, not just the pen. Now, there's no feather, there's no spread, there's no shading, but there really wasn't before. It's a solid performing blue ink right here, no problems, really looking good. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine, unaffected by the tone of this paper, with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading that managed to squeeze through. Take a look at managed on the first line. Mostly a mid-tone word. It's the downstroke of the G and the letter D that got quite a bit darker. Don't short the idea of how much I really had to work for that. Look at short on the first line. The SH is much darker than the OR in the middle, and the T darken up a little bit. It's no surprise that it is still shading because it did okay with this nib. It is a little surprising that it's shading this well on this paper. Not that it's shading like a beast, but it is coming through. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering and with no spread, with shading. Though it's not as well as it was on the Clairfontaine, it is definitely present. Take a look at the B in tub on the first line, coming in a bit darker than the rest of the word. Now, grumbled is all one uniform tone. It's a peppering of the shading, like the N of Balin on the third line is darker than the rest of the word. In fact, the B is a little bit darker than the ALI. It's just a light, tiny bit darker. The shading is not really jumping through here. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering and it has no spread. It does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at the air holes on the first line. The A is a little bit lighter than the IR. Now, holes starts dark on the H, lightens a little bit on the L, darkens again on the LE, and the S into the S lightens. It's the downstroke that gets a little bit darker. Now, the thing to notice here is with the quad rule. Does it stand out against it? It does. It stands on its own, which means if you were using this ink and in a quad rule notebook, you wouldn't have any problem with it blending into the background. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, little lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading here. We haven't really had it from this nib before. We had a tone shift on the second paper, but not shading. We can see shading on and 2 on the first line, where the AN is a little bit lighter than the D. The 2 goes dark at the T, light into the O. Safely starts as a midtone on the A, or on the S, light darkens just a tad bit on the A into the F, but it's during the F, it lightens up into the E, but the TY at the end do get darker. The shading is here. It's not huge. I'm pointing it out in more extreme than what's actually happening, but the fact that it's here, it does look nice. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We've got a pretty good performance here with some of the shading coming through just as well as it did with the Clairfontaine. I think this is showing off a little bit more of the lighter tones than it did on the Clairfontaine, though the tones that we're getting are the same. Shows the lighter a little bit more, shows some of the shading just a little bit more. Though it's not huge and jump out, it certainly is there, especially when you get some of the darker letters. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread, there is shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. But more what I'm really noticing is a little bit of breakup moments that are happening during some of the quad rule areas. Look at after on the second line. In the FT, you see a lot of areas where the ink didn't really bond into where that line was. Same thing happens with bail and lid, a lot of the words. So it seems that with a broad, it looks patchy is the word I would say, where it doesn't seem to really bond to the paper on the quad rule from the broad nib. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting. No surprises.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Krishna Orchios. Here is Lamy Washable Blue. Here is Montegrappa Blue.
Here is Organic Studio Mark Twain's Halley's Comet Blue.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not a surprise with this paper, as it has no feathering and it has no spread. This paper typically does fairly well with the fountain pen inks, but this one's made in Vietnam. There is some light feathering shading that's going on. Take a look at flicker of lights on the first line, where it is the left side of the F that is a bit darker than as it transitions into the L. But when it gets into the L, it darkens up into the I. It's during the C that it lightens up. Very dark at the KE, light again at the E, or on the R. Of goes light to dark, lights. The L is lighter at the top than it is at the bottom, and it holds some of that darkness into the I, lightening to a nice mid-tone on the GH, and the TS at the end, dark again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread and no shading. It's just a blue on the page. But, you know, a nice build up into it could be something. It's not particularly stand out. It does hold its own against the quad rule. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, which is lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Still no feathering and still no spread. Tiny peppering, just a light seasoning of some shading going on. Really, you can spot a letter, a comma, a period, that sort of thing. Darker, but not really shading so much. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade much better than it did on the Clairfontaine. Look it up on the first line. The U is light, the P is dark, the exclamation is dark. Ha ha! The tops of the H are lighter than the bottoms of the H, and the A stays dark. Now the second ha, uniform tone all the way. So it's not as predictable when you're going to get some of that shading. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and we can easily continue our notes back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Pink. Here is Sailor Gentle Apricot. Here is Noodler's Kin Shihang. Here is Diamine Golden Sands.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads. Sometimes it's a little bit distracting, like the H in shake, which is also a little bit darker, which shows that it can shade. It's not out of control in this case. It's a drier writing pen, which makes it much more manageable that if you had to, I suppose you could here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It feathers, it spreads, it does not really shade. It's there. This isn't the worst of the writing that I had with this today. There was other writing that went on, but this is not. This actually shows much better than what I was seeing when I had this at work with me. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There is feathering, there is spread. In this case, I think both of them are pretty manageable, though take a look at drink. It looks a little shaky, like it's getting a little bit drunk. Don't forget that there is some spread in forget directly underneath it. No small task in finding the shading when you look at task on the shading. Feathering when you look at task on the second line. God, I hate when I mess up like that, and I never go back at this point and fix them. Looking at the broad nib, It is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it feathers. Yes, it spreads just as bad as it did with some of the others, perhaps at times a little bit worse, said they on the first line, where it's not looking particularly good at the D or any of they. Shading isn't really there. I want to say this looks like you were just writing with some blue, which is really a shame considering this is a Sailor ink. Looking at the back of the page, we can see that we can't take any notes back here because the ink gets very deep into the paper. So there's a lot of ghosting. On this particular sheet, nothing bled through touching the page underneath. But while I was using copy paper at work with these pens, it did very frequently. But we're going to go with what happened here, that it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine gave the lightest but easily readable pleasant blue with some shading tone. The wet fine was the darkest, boldest, and almost no shading. The medium was, as the name of the nib would give, a nice mid-tone, a mid-ground in tone and shading, while the broad looked just like the medium, but with some wider lines. Now, I really was enjoying using this the most in that Ahab, which is finer writing if you don't go for the flex, and it's very wet. When I use blue, I can deal with it being plain. It's not my favorite thing, but I can deal with a plain old, boring, predictable blue. Boring's not bad. It just means I know what I'm going to get every time, and from a wet fine nib, that's what I get.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.